right. Hello, hello, everyone. Good evening. We are so glad that you're here. So when you jump in, folks, we're going to start in 1 minute. We're going to get started right on time. But when you're here, make sure that you toggle your chat to everyone from hosts and panelists. I think it's defaults to hosts and panelists, but toggle it to everyone. And then pop into the chat and let us know who you are and where you're from and what you teach. And I would love to know if anybody has worse weather than I have here. You will win a prize if it is warmer than 0. Hello. Oh, lots from St. Louis. Good. Hello in Detroit. Oh, look at our
Oh,
Detroit.
Michigan. Look at all these Michiganders. All right.
I love it. Wonderful. In Illinois. Oh, 20 degrees. That's pretty close, Brandon. All right. Well, it is 7:30 Eastern, 6:30 Central. And so we are just going to get started here to be respectful of everybody's time. Welcome, everyone. We're going to talk about Dunmore's Proclamation tonight. I am so excited to be here, working in partnership with the Virginia Geographic Alliance. On the call with us tonight is Chris Bunin, who is a high school teacher like many of you, and he serves on the Virginia Geographic Alliance Council. We are so thrilled. NCHE loves to work with different social studies organizations. I like to say we like to play in the sandbox. And so the National Council for History Education welcomes everyone here. I'm Jessica Ellison. I'm the executive director of NCHE, calling in from Minnesota and welcoming our wonderful speaker tonight, Dr. No. And so, Dr. No, I am going to turn off my screen and hand it right over to you. One more note, teachers. Please make sure that you use the chat as much as you'd like, but if you have any questions for Dr. No, please do use the Q&A function and we will address all questions at the end. We just want to make sure that none of the questions get lost in the chat, so please do use Q&A. So with that, Dr. No, I'm going to turn it right over to you.
All right. Hi, everybody. Hope you're all sitting comfortable now and everybody's got a refreshing beverage and we'll get started. I'm going to share my screen and have a PowerPoint for about half the time we're here, and then the rest of the time it'll just be me, my ugly face you got to look at here. Here we are. Oh, where did it go? There we go. So you're looking at a map there of colonial Virginia, which is where we're talking about tonight. And we're talking about Dunmore's Proclamation, and that's the Earl of Dunmore, the fourth, in fact, Earl of Dunmore. His name was John Murray. He was originally from Scotland, and he had briefly served as a governor of New York and then was assigned to Virginia in 1771. And he was not unpopular at the beginning. He had, in fact, taken on the Shawnees in something called Dunmore's War and gained territory in present-day Kentucky for the Virginians. So the plunderers were very pleased with that. And it also should be noted that he personally was a slave owner, of course, enslaved dozens of Africans, both in Virginia and the Caribbean, where he had land as well. So Virginia, we're looking at real important thing to understand as the revolution breaks out, that Virginia has a population of just over 500,000 people, and about 220,000 of them are enslaved Black people, about 40%. So big numbers. And that's why all this mattered so much. And the other thing we have to be aware of is exactly when in the revolutionary timeline this is all going to take place. So the proclamation is November 75. So that's late in the day. Ever since the Stamp Act in the 1760s, of course, there's been a whole decade of protests and discussions about liberty and of all kinds of contention between colonists and Britain. And enslaved people were aware of all of it. Enslaved people from Maine to the Florida line. the British troops, of course, most of the action has always been in Massachusetts. The British troops have been occupying Boston for quite a while by this point, since 1768. The other thing they were aware of, let me see if I can get this PowerPoint to, uh-oh, my PowerPoint isn't moving on. What am I doing wrong? No. Ah, there we go. All right. Sorry, folks. What had happened in 1772 was the Somerset decision in Britain. That had put the whole question of slavery on British soil in question. And the news of that had also spread throughout the colonies. By 73, December 73, we had the Boston Tea Party, and that had led Britain to pass the Coercive Acts, or the Intolerable Acts, where they'd shut down Boston Harbor and taken away the Massachusetts Charter and all that. And so at that point, the First Continental Congress had been called and had met. What George Washington had said, the cause of Boston is the cause of us all. And now this is really going to be a question about whether the whole 13 colonies are willing to rebel against England, or whether it's mostly still going to be a New England concern. Ever since the Somerset decision, we have records of people, even like young James Madison, reporting that enslaved people in Virginia were planning for the arrival of British troops. They'd heard about what was going on in Boston. They'd heard about the Somerset decision. And he had no doubt that should they come to what he called a hostile rupture with Britain, an insurrection among the slaves may and will be promoted. So both planters, British and enslaved, are all conscious before the proclamation that this was possible. If we skip ahead now to April 1775, just as the military commander in Boston had marched out to Lexington and Concord to seize the arsenal there before it would be grabbed by the rebels, Dunmore goes to try and seize, well, he in fact does successfully seize the gunpowder that was held in Williamsburg to make sure that the rebels don't use it. The planters in the House of Burgesses in the Virginia Assembly are arguing that that ammunition belongs to them, to the people, and to their government, and not to the British Crown. And so they're publicly condemning it, and they go to see him, and he unleashed on them. He was very angry that they would challenge him at all at that point. And he swore that if they did not, stop protesting this, he would declare freedom to the slaves and reduce the city of Williamsburg to ashes. And he told them, literally to their face, all the slaves would fight on the side of the government, meaning the British government. He's really at that point still hoping to scare them into sort of surrendering this hostile attitude. But even that sort of declaration he made off the cuff, the news of it spreads very, very quickly. Within weeks, or within days, I think maybe, the first group of slave arrives and offer their service to him and say, we will take up arms for you. He was sort of stunned at that point. He told them, get out of here, and threatened them with punishment, go about your business. But everybody's sort of alert to the possibility of this as 75 goes on. By the summer of 75, a couple of months after that, he has had to, in fact, take cover, really. He has gone out to Chesapeake Bay, and he's living on a warship because he understands that the planters now are up against him. Bunker Hill has happened by this time. It's really, although the declaration is a long way away, a year away, really, the colonists are at war. Dunmore was sailing up and down the coast a little bit, and any enslaved people he found on the coast, he was willing to free and have them join him. And then at one point he has to go to his hunting lodge, He's having a tree cut down to build a new mast for his boat. And the patriots hear that he's there, and a militia starts to walk on him, and the enslaved people at the lodge warn him that they are coming, and so he is able to make an escape. And is it really at this point that most people think it's when it really dawns on him in the late summer of 1775 that his only allies in Virginia, the only ones he can count on at least, are enslaved people. So he starts to organize those he's meeting occasionally. This is ahead of the proclamation. He's organizing any slaves that come to him into what becomes known as the Ethiopian Regiment. And so they are beginning to, at this point, it's not so many enslaved people, right? It's anybody who can get to a British boat. And meanwhile, also back in Britain, British people are suggesting they offer freedom to slaves. One guy, in fact, he'd been a former royal governor. Littleton had been a former royal governor in both South Carolina and in Jamaica. He got up in the House of Commons and proposed that they encourage, and I'm quoting, encouraging the Negroes in that part of America to rise against their masters. Now, that didn't go anywhere in Parliament because there's too many representatives there, or lobbyists for the Caribbean colonies, for the Sugar Islands, and so they didn't vote for that. But it seems very clear that the British government is at least considering it. And by November, he decides to write it. So let's have a look. Oh, this, first of all, I should say, this is in November where the first sort of battle takes place. Before the proclamation, the Ethiopian Regiment take on the militia of Princess Anne County. So you see where Norfolk and Princess Anne are there in the bottom right of the map. There was a little battle of Kemp's Landing. In modern times, it's under that Woodhaven, right? It's up here where the one of these creeks is. They meet on November 15, and the Ethiopian Regiment defeats the militia of Princess Anne County, and so Dunmore issues his proclamation. It's not clear what has been happening in the week between, because he signs this on November 7th, but he released it on November 15. But anyway, here we are with the actual words of the document. What he's going to do is offer the first large-scale emancipation of slave and servant labor in the history of colonial British America. There has been Bacon, and Bacon's Rebellion had offered freedom to slaves, but there were very few slaves in Virginia at that time. This is a big scale thing. And the word of this will get everywhere because plantations are based on these inland waterways, like all those creeks we just saw. The plantations are always right on the edge of the water, so they can roll those hogsheads, huge hogsheads of tobacco, onto the ships. And throughout the South, many enslaved people are pilots and watermen on the boats that work, right? And that is how news spreads, first of all within the colony and then without, by boatmen all up and down these creeks. So as he writes this, he will, let's go through it and then we'll analyze it a little bit. So I've ever entertained hopes that an accommodation might have taken place between Britain and this colony without being compelled by my duty to this most disagreeable, but now absolutely necessary step, rendered so by a body of armed men unlawfully assembled. And that army now on the march. In other words, because he can now claim that this incident at Kemp's Landing, where the militia have fired on people who are now thought of as British troops, these enslaved folks, that army now on their march to attack His Majesty's troops and destroy the well-disposed subject of this colony, to defeat such unreasonable purposes, and that all such traitors and their abettors may be brought to justice, I have thought fit to issue this proclamation. I do, in virtue of the power and authority to me given by His Majesty, determine to execute martial law and cause the same to be executed throughout the whole colony. So all throughout Virginia is going to be in a state of martial law. And to that end, that peace and good order may be sooner be restored, I require every person capable of bearing arms to resort to His Majesty's standard, to His Majesty's flag, or be looked upon as traitors, and thereby become liable to the penalty the law inflicts, such as forfeiture of life, confiscation of lands, and so on. And I do hereby further declare all indentured servants, so this applied more than to slaves, more than slaves, indentured servants, Negroes, or others appertaining to rebels, free, that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be, for the more speedily reducing this colony to a proper sense of their duty to His Majesty's crown and dignity. And I do further order and require that all His Majesty's liege subjects retain their quit rents or other taxes due, keep them in your custody until peace comes, and my officers will come and get them. Given under my hand on board the ship William on the 7th day of November in the 16th year, so Dunmore. So this official document, right, as we've said, he declares martial law, and he decides all revolutionaries are traitors to the crown. And then that all servants, Negroes or others, free, that are able and willing to bear arms. There aren't many indentured servants left in Virginia. A lot of indentured servants still in the colonies, but by this stage, by the 1770s, most people who wanted an indentured servitude went to Pennsylvania. And so that didn't really affect very many people in Virginia anymore. So why does he do this, right? He expected it to have several effects. Yes, it would boost his numbers. He only had about 300 soldiers under his command in Virginia, because most British folks are up in Boston, British soldiers. But really, he's actually hoping that this will create such a fear among the colonists of a general slave uprising that they would abandon the revolution. So he's trying to call their bluff. And that, now we know the end of the story, we go, well, that was silly. But it really wasn't an unreasonable bluff at the time, right? The Caribbean islands under British rule had all been subject to the Stamp Act and all the subsequent customs duties, and they'd been invited to the First Continental Congress, but they had not sent delegates because they knew how much they depended on the British Navy and their other resources to maintain slavery. South Carolina had a black majority, 53% or so, they reckon. So this idea that if we scare them with a slave uprising, they will, they'll back off the revolution, really was probably what he expected to be the foremost outcome of this proclamation. He was, of course, very wrong. Richard Henry Lee in Virginia, he writes, his Lord Dunmore's unparalleled conduct in Virginia has, a few Scotch excepted, united every man in that large colony. By early December, the Virginia Gazette branded Dunmore the King of the Blacks. And so officially, the Virginia Convention is outraged, of course, and they respond with their declaration that all fugitive slaves will be executed. Right, so you can see it there. Whereas Dunmore has offered freedoms to such able-bodied slaves as are willing to join him and take up arms against the good people of this colony, giving thereby encouragement to a general insurrection, which may induce a necessity of inflicting the severest punishments upon those unhappy people, already deluded by his base and insidious arts. So it is enacted that all Negro or other slaves conspiring to rebel or make insurrection shall suffer death and be excluded all benefit of clergy. They will not have a Christian burial. We think it proper to declare that all slaves who have been or shall be seduced by his proclamation or any other arts to desert their master's service and take up arms shall be liable to such punishment. And to that end, all such who have taken this unlawful and wicked step may return in safety to their duty and escape the punishment due to their crimes. We hereby offer pardon to them upon their surrendering themselves and not appearing in arms after the publication hereof. And we do further earnestly recommend it to all humane and benevolent people in this colony to explain and make known this our offer of mercy to those unfortunate people. So this proclamation, the response proclamation by the Virginia House of Burgesses is published in full in the Virginia Gazette. They organized patrols to start to look out for any enslaved people trying to get to take Dunmore up on his offer. And they also put out this whole message that he's probably a liar, that right? In other words, they are speaking directly to the slaves, even in this newspaper, because they know the message will get out. They say he owns slaves and he will, if you run to him, he will sell you to the Sugar Islands, to the West Indies, which is a much worse fate. And enslaved people knew that the Sugar Islands are fatal to enslaved people in terms of what the work of processing sugar does to people. And so that would be a fate worse than being enslaved in Virginia. And so the paper says, be not then tempted by his proclamation to ruin yourselves. And so even though apparently, slaves have not been allowed to learn to read, everyone knows that some can, and that the news travels fast, that those boatmen take the news from one plantation to another, and then beyond Virginia, right? In South Carolina, of course, this is even more outrageous, right? That any British officer or government official is saying they'll emancipate the slaves. It's just beyond the pale. And the consensus there among the planters was that, and I've got a quote from one of those guys, that this proclamation would more effectively work an eternal separation between Britain and the colonies than any other expedient. In fact, we know that the word spread so far as to reach a young man named Titus in New Jersey. He's a 21-year-old farmhand, and he walked off the farm and began walking south from New Jersey to Williamsburg within days of the proclamation. We'll mention him later. He joined the Ethiopian regiment, and before returning to New Jersey, where he became a feared guerrilla fighter. He led a series of raids with a whole troop of people who were free like him, attacking patriot farms and so on. So let's see if that's enough with that. And so, let me see, where am I? Here we go. The big picture then of what happens is that Dunmore's proclamation, number one, unites the South and brings in Southern planters many who had been loyalist or who had been neutral, to join the patriot cause. we remember, you see all the time, the radicals, right? The Patrick Henry and the Thomas Jefferson and stuff, but they're not necessarily the typical Southern planter at this point. They were sort of the freaking radicals who were free, crying out for liberty and independence. The vast majority of Southern planters had been much more loyal to the crown than we think of the New Englanders, right? These are some of the richest men in the colonies. The system works for them. So we have to try and understand why they become revolutionaries. Now, they didn't like taxes, but nobody likes taxes anywhere. That doesn't usually make you say you're going to take up arms against your government. But this idea that his proclamation was inciting slave insurrection is generally agreed that this is when the South turned revolutionary. They did everything, as we've said, and I'll talk about one who Robert Carter, we know the personal story of him trying to stop this information from getting to his slaves. He has big plantations he has plantations all over Virginia, but he has some down in that area, down near Norfolk and so on, near the coast. He gathered all the slaves on that plantation and warned them personally, had a big meeting and said, you'll have heard these rumors. This governor's offering you freedom, but it's all a scheme. He's going to sell you to the Sugar Islands. Don't go to him. According to his diaries and letters, all the enslaved men absolutely vowed they would not join him. In fact, if they saw a British boat, they were going to take the wives and kids and hide in the woods to stay away from it. So he was a little surprised to learn that when a British ship did appear off the coast near his plantation, 32 enslaved people went to join Dunmore. The estimates of the actual number of slaves who reached him were varied, but it's somewhere between at least 800 and not more than 2,000. And this is one of the things that united the South, was that the enslaved didn't care if their masters were patriots or rebels. Also, right, although Dunmore officially in this proclamation only offers it to the slaves, only offers freedom to those enslaved by rebels, the slaves are going to get there, right? If I get to the coast, I'll say my master was a rebel. And so what they have to do then, right? Every enslaved person in Virginia, and even further afield, as we see with Colonel Ty, as they called him, have to decide whether they will take the risk of trying to make it. And it's an enormous risk, right? So the British aren't really helping very much. If a British ship comes up your creek, up your river, they will happily take you on board, but they're not exactly fighting to go out and get you. And so you have to risk, and these planters have said they will kill you. They will kill you if you go for it. The next biggest sort of event was on December 9th. There was another Battle of Great Bridge. That was a loss for the British and the Ethiopian regiment, although they didn't take a direct part in the actual fighting. But it's from that battle that we hear these reports that they'd made themselves sashes with the words liberty to slaves, that they had decided what this war was about, and it was about liberty, but it was about liberty for them. In the end, things turn against Dunmore, not in the end, actually pretty quickly. And by summer of 76, he has to leave Virginia completely. He takes about 300 enslaved people with him. Many of the rest have suffered from smallpox and he's abandoned them, and others have been caught. But he does take 300 away. And that left this sort of vacuum, if you like, of, well, what is the situation now? Is this British policy? Because nothing had really come out of Britain, right? Just from this one guy. But is it British policy that any slave who can get to the British forces are free or not? Well, it becomes the default policy, although there is no declaration for several years, but Navy captains continue to go up and down the coast, the southern coast, and they will take on board any southern slave who manages to get to them. And of course, the boatmen of the South, as I said, are often black, and they are helping letting slaves know that there's a boat off the coast, and if you can get there, you're going to be free. The big switch comes in the very late December 1778, when, after the losses, of course, at Saratoga, the British decide on their southern strategy. They figure they'll never get New England back, but New England was never worth that much to them anyway. Let's get our big, rich southern colonies back. And they decide in 1778 that that's where they're going to go. They're going to give up in New England for the most part. They leave an army up in New York, but they're coming to the South. And this is the point where Dunmore's proclamation gets switched and becomes the British policy officially. Those slaves who've already escaped onto those British boats are helping. They help with the invasion of the South via Savannah in December 78. They help those British boats navigate tricky harbors and sandy banks and the coastline in general. And then in June 1779, the new commanding general of the British, Sir Henry Clinton, issues something called the Philipsburg Proclamation. And that just takes the Dunmore Proclamation and says it's national or colonial wide, that any slave owned by a revolutionary anywhere in the colonies was free. And he said even if they didn't enlist in the British Army, if they, they could help in any way, they were free. That actually results in a much greater number, because obviously now we're talking about the whole colonies of people running away. He promised to every Negro who shall desert the rebel standard full security to follow within these lines any occupation which he shall think proper. So if you can get into any territory that the British are holding, you'll be free, and you don't have to join the army. And that, puts the place on fire. The estimate is that about 100,000 enslaved people attempted to get away, and that about 25,000 succeeded. Succeeded on a semi-permanent basis, got into the army, or got into the British. Many served behind the scenes, right? So the women who got away helped with laundry and all that kind of stuff. They helped the British in every way they can. The rest who didn't make it, it's really a horrific story of what happens in the South. There's a certain level of anarchy throughout the South, the Carolinas in particular, throughout the Revolutionary War, because there are both patriot and loyalist militias. And these are bandits, really, in certain places. And they steal slaves from the plantations of the others. And in fact, many of these people who were trying to get away were then offered as enlistment bounties. So the patriot colonial governments of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, to try and get more Southern white boys to join up, offered them a captured slave as a bounty. So those who got away, we should talk a little bit about them. What did they do? As I said, some get to serve as soldiers. In many cases, however, the British are still very reluctant to arm a black man, and so they are put into what's called the Black Company of Pioneers, where they serve as support role people. They're cutting down the trees for fuel, they gather food, they clean, they cook, rather than being allowed into combat modes. Of course, we've mentioned Colonel Ty up in New Jersey. He was a sort of special case. He was given other guys, and they were able to raid patriot settlements all over. We should also note that, of course, African Americans are getting free in the North for joining the Continental Army in certain places, right? Because Washington had real trouble keeping together that Continental Army with both death and desertions, and each colony had to provide a quota. And so, for example, Rhode Island in 1778 finally voted to allow the enlistment of every able-bodied Negro, mulatto, or Indian man slave. And every slave so enlisting shall, upon his passing muster, be immediately discharged from the service of his master or mistress and be absolutely free. Their former owners were compensated, unlike, of course, in the South. The former owners of the Rhode Island slaves would be paid by the state for the value, what was given, market value of persons. So the Phillipsburg Proclamation, this sort of second proclamation, this wider one made by Clinton in 79, remains the official policy right up till the end of the war, and is still in place when Cornwallis surrenders. But as Cornwallis is at Yorktown in 1781, getting surrounded, both the French are in the harbor, Washington is now surrounding him, and so he's under siege for about a month. He pushes out all the African Americans who'd come to serve, and pushes them. They're literally chased out of his camp into the hands of the planters who will seize them. The one British officer famous for trying to honor the promise was Sir Guy Carleton, who served as commander-in-chief in New York City. And he did try to keep the free after the peace agreement was settled, the truce. George Washington went up there and argued with him that he should be returning all these people, but he said no. He had they'd been promised, but he created this famous document called the Book of Negroes. It was just sort of, to show Washington. He said, well, if I'm proven wrong, I've got all their names here, and maybe we can get them back for you. And it's just a bluff, but it's sort of an important document because he has these 3,000 names of people when there are so few records of this era, of 3,000 formerly enslaved African Americans who get to go to Canada with Guy Carleton. The experience in Canada, again, is not good. They're given pretty crappy lands, and then they're either tricked or forced into kind of indentures to try and make them work for nothing. And so a whole bunch of them say, we want to go back to Africa, and they create a new colony called Sierra Leone, and 1,200 of them set sail for there. Among one of them was a man called Harry Washington. He'd been a slave under George. And in fact, when things aren't good in Sierra Leone, Harry Washington is the leader of a kind of rebel movement or protest movement there. It's pretty funny. Those who had served in the Continental Army found that they were not rewarded well. They would not be allowed to be in the army after 1792. It excluded them from military service, and only about 500 were ever able to claim a pension. But the big stories of it, their stories and the fact that they'd helped sort of fuel the movement to end slavery. As we know, or I hope you know, Mom Bet Freeman and others immediately after the war start suing for their freedom in Massachusetts, and winning under the new Massachusetts state constitution. And then very quickly there's a snowball whereby all the northern states end slavery. And then the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, also gets abolished in 1808. And a lot of that is from, the stories that had gone out of the service on both sides. So the British are willing to abolish the slave trade, and the Americans, except of course South Carolina. That's sort of the end of the story, but the truth is we were learning more and more and more as more people do this research, and it's difficult research to do, right? Because there's just, the documentation is not tidily gathered anywhere. But there's a couple of books by historians. I've just finished one of them called A Southern Underground Railroad. And he says that it never really ends. The attempt to get to freedom never really ends for many of those slaves in Georgia and South Carolina who know that they can get to Florida, and for a while Florida is in Spanish hands and then it's in British hands, and if they can get down there. And so they continue all through the after-war period, and for 30 years, they try to get to Florida. Gradually, even when it becomes back under United States ownership, they get to the Seminoles. And the truth is, it's a more continuous line of freedom than we usually sort of stop the story when the revolution ends. But the story from the African American point of view, from the enslaved point of view, is that this is a continuous line from Dunmore, from just before his proclamation, from the Somerset decision, all the way till about 1816. There's a great story of a place called Prospect Bluff. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's way down. It's now, I think, in a national park. We can't even get there. It's a couple of 100 miles from Pensacola, of slaves who'd escaped and created a whole maroon community down there, and managed to, in fact, as the British invaded the area in the War of 1812s, and they left the fort after they were chased back out again. They left the fort to black runaways who'd come to join them, as their parents, I guess, a generation before had tried to join the British Army. This second group in the 18 teens have come down to try and join the British and get their freedom at Prospect Bluff. And they hold the fort for about a year until it's finally blown up on 1816. And so I thought, I've been reading these stories about this later period, and I'm going, oh my golly, it really is this continuous line of, from Dunmore on, of an attempt to get to somewhere the British are, somewhere where there's people who have guns, and we want the guns. We learn to use them, and they do. You see, they take over that fort at Prospect Bluff and manage it and keep the British off for a while, or the Americans. At that point, it's General Jackson by then. In this fight for freedom. And so I think, if you just study Dunmore's proclamation in isolation, it's not nearly as big a story as it is if you sort of stand back and look at this bigger perspective of enslaved people seemingly with almost no route out, taking every opportunity and enormous risk to get somewhere where they will be provided with a weapon and therefore can fight for themselves. And so I think as we start to tell this story, it's a longer line, it's a longer timeline than it used to be. I've been talking for a very long time. I should stop here and take some questions.
But it's so interesting. I mean, this is what I love about history, is that you think you know the story. And then, oh wait, here's more information.
Right. I
And
mean, yeah,
rip
I'm still fascinated with this, these couple of new books I've heard about. I'm going, what? And how I've been teaching American history for, whatever it is, 20 years and didn't know it. I'm like, so I love it. I love it when historians can find new sort of archives that were lost somewhere, or not even lost, but they were just on microfiche and nobody wanted to read it.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't even know if they use microfiche anymore. I'm sure
Right, right.
they did. Well, we do have a couple of questions from teachers, and teachers feel free to continue to put them in. And so we have a question from Edwin, and he asks, why tag it Ethiopia? So I think he's referring to the regiment. Why was it called the Ethiopia Regiment?
That's just sort of at the time a synonym almost for Africa. And it was sort of a very bold statement in those days of extraordinary levels of white supremacy, that he's declaring the Empire Strikes Back, that they are Africans, and that they proudly so, and they're going to take it to you. So why Ethiopia as opposed to Angola or anywhere else? I don't know, but it was just a sort of statement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Edwin, he followed up with another question in the Q&A. He's asking because he thought that the majority of the enslaved people came from the western coast of Africa.
They did.
Yeah, and so which informed that movement to seek to settle in Sierra Leone. So it's interesting that they would choose Ethiopia, like you said,
Yeah.
rather than Angola.
Yeah, I don't even know why. I've never heard an explanation for it. Um,
That would be a really interesting question for students to ponder. You know, when
mm.
we think about why people name things the way that they do,
I
why?
wonder, is there some reference to it in literature or something? You know, I should look that up maybe, because I never even pondered it before. Um, you know, does Shakespeare use Ethiopia
Mm,
interchangeably with Africa or something? You know,
yeah. Yeah, so much of it is
there
like
might be
from
some kind of not conquered by Europeans. Mm.
Oh, interesting.
But was that true in, 1776? I don't know, golly.
But I love this. This is
But
why yeah.
it's a good question. Let's find
Yeah,
out.
good conversation. So Jill says, if we as history teachers were to teach Dunmore's proclamation as a
Mm.
document-based question, what should we ask our students?
You know, I would ask them to think about, of course, I don't know what age of students you're dealing with, but what, what was Dunmore hoping to get out of it? And what is your impact if you're an enslaved person? What are you going to have to figure out?
Mm,
You know, and to think the logistics of how far are you from water? How far are you from a British ship? How much are you prepared to risk? Um, because the courage to even after this, it's easy to stand up and say, "I offer freedom to you people." He's not taking really much risk.
mm,
They have to take all the risk, and so who's prepared to do it. I think it's not unusual that you see, this character I talked about, Colonel Ty, this Titus from New Jersey comes out. He's a young, unattached guy. He's 21, right? But if you are a mother of children, you're going to have to get them out too. And they did leave, that's the remarkable thing to me. Sometimes I go, who's got the nerve to do all that? Put your kids in a boat, a leaky boat, over during the night and try and get down the river. Fantastic. So but I would, as the document, I would sort of make them question: did Dunmore really think that they would all go, or what's he trying to do here?
mm.
And then perhaps consider it for from an enslaved perspective, and sort of also that way it challenges in the Virginia Gazette as well, the Virginia Rebels response, the Patriot response, how there's this unacknowledged reality that they know slaves can read, can spread word, that they can put things in the newspaper, even though legally they're trying to control all of those things, that they don't have control, right? They don't have control. And that it makes us ponder the numbers again, as I said at the beginning. How can you control 40% of the population in wartime? And they know it, and they're terrified. Their other book is it's an older one now, Forced Founders by Woody Holton, who talks about, we think of the Virginia planters as the big leaders, they're very grand, swaggering big guys, and how they were, really forced, that they were scared. They were scared into declaring independence. That it, they didn't necessarily want it the way the Bostonians wanted it. But they were frightened if they didn't fight at this point, right? And that's really the story of the proclamation, is that it joins the South Carolinians and the Virginians and everybody together to say, oh no, we're in this revolution now. It's just not just Boston's problem.
There is so much to pull apart with that statement. Because, I mean, the same fears linger then as we get up into the 19th century and the Civil War, these fears of what happens if enslaved people revolt. And, these ideas that these men in power are able, like you said, not to put out there without much risk to themselves. But then the people who it affects, they have so much to consider.
They have so much, right? Because they've read the Virginia Gazette proclamation too that says we'll kill you if we catch you. You've got to, there's a short term of a pardon here. If you run away, you can come back now and we'll pardon you. But you don't come back, or you from now on, you go. We will kill you. And there've been enough people punished that way that they can't take that idly either.
Yeah.
So
And
it's not an enormous risk.
And Jill followed that up and said that middle school students would love to ponder the quote risk versus reward side from the perspective of those enslaved, especially if we get students to take themselves out of their current moment where they have access to a computer in their hand at all times, that enslaved people don't have any of that and don't have maps and don't necessarily know where to go.
Except, I mean, the part that they get away because they know their geography. Those who escape, right? And that's what I talk. These black boatmen. Just a year or two before, another one of them was hung for trying to spread this word about the Somerset decision in South Carolina. Those guys know that territory really well. They know they are the ones who are hired to be the pilots for the bigger boats. And undoubtedly, there's a lot of collective action. We'll all go, and one guy knows the way, and he's going to lead us. I don't, people go in boatloads. I mean, small boats. I'm talking about canoes of 4 and 6 and 8 people. They go together. And so I assume that they have done some serious planning. You would have to have some serious planning, which means you also have to trust the others on the plantation not to betray you. Right? And yeah, but they do know the geography, and this is really why the planters are so scared and they're trying to say all these things, because they know these guys, if they set their minds to it, a lot could get away. But the other thing I always think about, this fear that in fact they won't just escape, but that they'll kill their old master, is largely unfounded. And it's the same at the end of the Civil War. A lot of people just walk off the plantation. They don't turn around and try and kill the master. They just say bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. See?
Yeah.
And that was true in the Revolution too. There wasn't some big attempt to kill lots of white people. They just wanted to be free and to walk away, and did every chance they got.
Which is another good thing for students to be able to ponder this idea of where do these fears come from? Like we hear about Nat Turner, but that was the exception.
That's the exception, yeah.
More than the rule. And so how do these fears then grow that lead to things such as the Civil War? No. Okay, we have another question from Miranda, and she has a logistical question. She says, what is the name of the area in Pensacola that you were talking about?
It's called Prospect Bluff.
Prospect Bluff.
And I think right now you can't get, it's in a sort of one of these big protected wetlands or something, and it's in a national park or national, what do you call it? National forest or national. But it's sort of crazy story, amazing story. But yeah, it was then remote, and it still is a remote sort of area, not given easily. But they had built a whole maroon community of, I mean, there were upwards of 1,000 people perhaps living along in farms all along that coast. And then they got the chance to hold the fort. They took it, and they cleared acreage and built, they had farms and everything going. And these were all people who had escaped over the previous few years from either Georgia or South Carolina.
That's amazing.
So yeah, there's a book called The Maroons of Prospect Bluff. Yeah, pretty amazing.
Wonderful. Well, we've hit all of the questions. So before we sign off tonight, anything else that you want to make sure that our teachers know? I love that you were referring back to the geography as being one of the things that helped enslaved people so much. and the geography too of, and this is something I love to learn about the revolution, is that what was happening in Boston is not necessarily supported by people in other colonies.
Yeah, this is why we talk about Dunmore's proclamation as an important moment on the timeline, right? In that, even so, George Washington, we sort of put that quote of George Washington, "The cause of Boston is the cause of us all," is like 74. It's late in the game if you think about the Stamp Act in 64.
Mm.
Almost every bit of action has happened in New England. And again, Patrick Henry's been making his speeches and stuff, but they are very young, those revolutionaries. The Patrick Henrys, Thomas Jeffersons, Washington, Madison's in college. And the vast bulk of the Southern plantation elite are their father's generation and their uncle's generation, or in Washington's case, his big brother. And they are not the freaking radicals of these, it's like listening to these young college students who are saying, oh, right? They're going, yeah. I mean, I'm not pleased with the government, but let's simmer down now, right? Simmer down. And then, as that guy said, nothing has, pushed them over that line to becoming revolutionaries like this proclamation did. And they felt they could defend themselves, unlike the Caribbean islands, where they said we can't even join in a revolution because we are just too dependent on the British. The Virginians and South Carolinians had created their own kinds of slave patrols, had created their own safety net, and their numbers weren't quite as, right? Obviously, in the Caribbean, the slave population is 80 to 90% of the population, not 40 to 50. And so in the South, they have this other reaction. They just hate the British more for it, that they've done this. And so, that's the biggest cause of it in short term, is to unite the Southern whites for the revolution. And then in the long term, though, is this different consequence where, as I was just saying, it starts a 50-year movement of enslaved people to try and get to foreign forces to free, mostly British, but occasionally Spanish. Can they get out and can they fight for their freedom? If they can reach a foreign foe, then they can get some guns and they can do it themselves. And that doesn't burst out, it's only 1,000 people or something after Dunmore's proclamation at first. But then over the course of the war, it's at least 25,000, and some say about 100,000 tried to get out. And so they must tell their children the stories, right? Over the 1780s and the 1790s. Here's a chance, here's how we can do it. Listen up, learn the rivers. It's almost always by water, of course. It's much easier to be caught over land trying to escape. But if you can get out on the water, you have a chance. And so that long-term history is kind of very different than the short-term history. Yeah.
Oh, this is fantastic. Thank you so much for spending time with us tonight, Dr. No. And I mean, so much of this I'd never known before. I only know of Dunmore. He was the last, and he was on the boat back to England after 1775. So thank you so very much for being with us. And thank you, teachers, for spending time with us this evening. And
yeah, I'm glad you could all show up. That's kind of fabulous. I know it's late in the year, late in the evening.
yeah, these are the best. These teachers are the best. So teachers, thank you so much for showing up and listening along with me tonight. And Dr. No, thanks so much for opening this up for all of us.
All right.